for you there?
What? Oh, it's being live streamed. Okay.
Okay. I think this means that we're officially live.
Yes.
That's official. There you go. Okay, let me move this. All right, everyone, welcome. On behalf of Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center, we are so pleased to welcome back virtually, but welcome back home each and every time to David Siegel. And I have a little bit of an intro. David Siegel is the president of the Friends of ELNET, the European Leadership Network, which we will hear more about, the most important organization strengthening the relationship between Europe and Israel. David is a former Israeli diplomat involved in foreign policy formulation at the highest levels. He served as Consul General to the Southwest United States, Chief of Staff to Israel's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Director of the Foreign Ministry's International Organizations Department, and Chief of Staff to 3 of Israel's ambassadors to the United States. He holds an MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA in Political Science from the University of Vermont. But what's not in his bio is what I will add, that David is a dear friend of Sinai Temples, a dear friend of Sinai Akiva Academy. I was thrilled to see you, I feel like it was just a few months ago, in person, and we are truly blessed to have you this evening. You know, every time, I hope everyone out there hears this, every time we ask David to address our community, whether it's the Sinai Temple community, our Nazarian leadership program for our teenagers in Israel, whichever area of the world we are, if David is there, David, you always say yes, and you always show up, and we are so blessed with your warmth and your friendship and your brilliance. And so we are truly grateful to you. We have so much to discuss tonight. I'm going to put it out there kind of in front that we're going to be certainly, David and I have said over and over, we cannot believe the timing of tonight's discussion and presentation. And so, as I mentioned, we'll certainly be hearing about the importance of ELNET. We'll be hearing about what is currently happening in the Ukraine. I'll be asking David a little bit later about his predictions. I just feel that we could not be more blessed to have you at this particular moment in time. And so just so everyone knows, as David starts his presentation, I'll turn off my camera so that we have a better chance of learning from you. And then I'll come back on for the Q&A. I have a series of questions. And as David is speaking, I hope that you will all take your own notes and your own questions because you can certainly send them to Rebecca Small, who is on, and she'll send me the questions as well. David, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you to Temple Sinai. It is wonderful to be back with you. Rabbi, we have met and had exchanges with delegations when you came to Israel, and no matter what the weather was, I remember one very rainy evening where we met in Tel Aviv with the young kids, and it's really great to be back and to talk to you about a very important topic tonight. But first, I just want to say, look, you know, Sinai was our community when I was in Los Angeles for 5 years. My 3 kids were raised at Sinai Akiva, were bar mitzvahed, each in his and her turn. They've all turned out to be proud Jews and Israeli patriots, and much of that was thanks to our 5 years in Los Angeles together with you. So it's really an honor to be back and to say thank you, Rabbi, for hosting us tonight. And boy, what a day! The timing is very significant. And I guess before we get to the main topic, it's important. And since I am, you know, speaking to a synagogue group, this is Shabbat Vayakel. This is the Torah portion of the Shabbat, and it's always ironic and uncanny that the Torah portion always speaks to what we're experiencing in our own time. And Vayakel is all about Moses coming down from the mountain, seeing the chaos of the gold calf, and and having to make a decision what to do, how to take the mob and turn that mob into a community. And late Rabbi Sachs has a beautiful piece about the importance of community in Judaism. And by community, I mean the Sinai community, and working together and working for the common good and building character of individuals as a community. But it doesn't just stop at Sinai. Community is something that we all need. Community is a phenomenon that Israel needs. Look at the way the world is right now. Look at the changing global order, and it really is. And I think we need, it's time to be blunt and to take the gloves off and to say things as they are. The world is changing before our eyes very, very dramatically. In fact, it has been changing, but now it's thrown into stark relief. What happened today with the unprovoked invasion by Russia of Ukraine is just extraordinary, this moment in time. It will change our future. It will change the world as we know it and knew it. And I think it's time for us to think very, very deeply about what all of this means. Community means a community of nations, a community of Western nations coming together under the leadership of the United States and NATO to take a stand. And we hope very much that they do take a stand. And I think we're learning the hard way that sanctions without real military power simply is not enough. Unfortunately, we've seen this time and time again in recent years, and we're seeing it again now. It has not deterred Putin, and there's a lot of concern about what the next steps will be. No one knows, but we can certainly talk about the various assessments, but I'm sure you get this from CNN and from the newspapers. So I want to spend most of my time tonight talking about the importance of this mission. Our mission, ELNET, the European Leadership Network, is about defending the 1 million Jews in Europe, and think about the 300,000 Jews in Ukraine, including 40,000 of them that are in poverty and need of food and shelter at this moment. But there are Jewish communities all over Europe, in the UK, in France, and elsewhere, that have been deeply affected by anti-Semitism, by anti-Zionism, that fuels anti-Semitism on the continent, like it does here in the United States. So you have the Jewish dimension of Europe, but you also have the geostrategic dimension of how do we defend Israel, the Jewish state, in this era in history. The United States is facing dual strategic threats, both by Russia in Europe and by China in the far Pacific. The Pentagon has not faced a two-front war scenario in at least a decade, and will have to reintroduce the whole notion of more military power, more military spending, and so will the NATO powers if they want to be taken seriously. For Israel, what this means is that the United States will no longer be able to pay attention strategically and to act strategically in the Middle East like we were used to before. So the world is changing before our eyes, not for the better. In some ways, we'll see there's a silver lining here in terms of the changing Middle East and the Abraham Accords, and the fact that Israel is seen as an anchor of stability and strength in the Middle East. This is why the Abraham Accords came to be a little over a year ago, with 4 Arab countries and other Arab countries that unofficially are part of that alliance. But we're also seeing more and more countries coming to the table, seeking a relationship with Israel, a strategic relationship with Israel in other parts of the Middle East. I'm including in that Egypt and Jordan, the Eastern Mediterranean countries. And by that, I mean all of them: Cyprus, Greece, Italy, France, further away Spain, but of course Morocco and Northern Africa. These are countries that are coming together for various reasons on various issues, connecting with Israel, whether it's a fear of Iran, a fear of Turkey, a fear of a radical Islam. So the world is changing and the region is changing. ELNET was born 15 years ago by a member of your community, of the Sinai community, Larry Hochberg, who's with us tonight. I can't see him on the screen, but I know he's with us. And you should be proud that once again, LA was the place of the birth of an important pro-Israel Jewish organization. There are others. ELNET was born in Chicago and in Los Angeles. And we have leaders and donors in your community, in the Sinai community, that understand what's at stake. ELNET was born 15 years ago under the idea that the continent of Europe, which is so close to Israel, these are 36 democratic countries right beyond the Middle East, right adjacent to Israel's strategic neighborhood, that these countries do not have a pro-Israel network that is significant, that could have policy impact, that can help bring these countries closer to Israel. So ELNET was born, it began small, but in recent years, we've become 5 branches in Europe, each independent, each one run by Europeans. So this is not an offshoot of an American organization, but these are authentic European networks with board members and political activists, and in some cases, hundreds and thousands of volunteers that work with our offices that are becoming more and more regional. And we're able, while being a small organization, little more than $7 million a year, to cover the entire continent effectively. We have a large office in Israel. Everything we do is in-house. And this year, we're bringing 25 delegations to Israel from Europe. We were very active even during COVID. We were, in fact, the only organization that I know of that systematically brought delegations to Israel even during COVID. And our largest delegation was the largest delegation that Israel received in 2 years from anywhere in the world by any organization. And that was a delegation this summer of 36 members of the French parliament that came to Israel and literally had the country to themselves because they were the only tourists, the only delegation. So they became advocates for Israel when they went back home. This is almost 10% of the French parliament. And remember that France is facing elections in a little over a month now, very close elections. So having politicians come to Israel at that level at such a sensitive time is very, very significant. So we work with these 5 offices in Europe doing political advocacy, delegations to Israel, bringing senior Israeli officials to Europe to speak at important conferences, think tanks, to meet with government officials. We've also been very involved in creating diplomatic opportunities, even summits between Israeli and European leaders where they can discuss the strategic issues that Israel is facing. And now more and more with the Abraham Accords, we're bringing Europe into the widening circle of normalization between Israel and the Arab countries. It's very, very important to continue nurturing this growing alliance. And for this, it's not enough to have just the United States at the table. It's important to have these 36 European countries, and certainly the most important ones, France, Germany, the UK, at the table to continue supporting and enlarging this process. So at this time, when we have the war in Europe, when Europe is now waking up from a deep slumber and realizing that the necessity for military power, for national security awareness, for cybersecurity defenses is high, the relationship with Israel becomes more and more important for Europe. So if I may show a slide, the first slide, a cutest slide, show you a picture of why Europe is so important to Israel. And we'll start with the Israeli side of the equation. Europe, and not many people know this, Europe is Israel's largest trade partner. That means to remain a military power that is able to defend itself, Israel needs a strong economy. A strong economy means having strong economic partners. Europe is Israel's strongest economic partner. 1/2 of Israel's imports come from Europe, and 1/3 of Israel's exports, including defense exports, goes to Europe, to those 36 countries. So Europe is incredibly important for Israel's economy, which is very important, incredibly important, critically important for Israel's military capabilities into the future. Europe, of course, is important for Israel, not in fighting side by side with the Israelis, but providing Israel with diplomatic cover. And you see that Europe is critical in terms of its membership in the United Nations, in participating in the Iran nuclear talks. You can't do this without the Europeans, and it's very, very important to educate them about the issues that Israel is facing vis-a-vis Iran in the Middle East, and UN issues, the International Criminal Court issues. The Europeans are very, very important. And in a moment, we'll show you what they've been doing, which I think will be surprising to you. But before we leave the economic front, please realize that Europe is also the largest funder of Israeli innovation. So if we are proud of Israel as a startup nation, proud of Israel's, the Technion, Hebrew University, the defense industries, the science, the water, the agriculture, much of the funding is coming from Europe. And in fact, Europe just established a new fund for the next decade of over 100 billion euro, which Israel was almost excluded from. But through working with our friends, in fact, 10 countries led by Germany, Israel is included in the most important innovation funding program in the world today for the next 10 years. And this is some of the work that we do behind the scenes. Fighting anti-Semitism in Europe, of course, is incredibly important in terms of BDS, anti-Zionism, the Jewish communities facing spiking anti-Semitism in the streets of Europe. So having the governments partner with us in fighting anti-Semitism is incredibly important. And it's important here in the United States as well. Remember that the synagogue that was attacked in Texas last month, the perpetrator was a Muslim radical from the UK. And his cell was arrested by the UK authorities as a result of the incident here in the United States. So just like COVID, you can't fight it in one corner of the room. You can't fight anti-Semitism in one quarter of the world here in the United States without dealing with the issue globally and of course online. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the fact that the United States is diminishing its presence in the Middle East. This has been a strategy for over a decade, and we're certainly seeing it in very stark relief right now. I'd like to share with you one more slide tonight. We're not going to give you too much, but just look at this, this report card of what we've seen from Europe over the last year. 26 European countries have adopted IRA, and for those of you that don't know, that is the internationally accepted definition of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. 26 countries are pledged to fight anti-Semitism in Europe more than any other continent on earth. The next number is incredibly important. For those of you who believe that we need to be stronger against Iran and not just wait for the negotiators in Vienna when it's out of our hands, and it is unfortunately out of our hands, and we'll talk about that more tonight. We've been able to ban Hezbollah in 12 countries in Europe. And when Germany did it as a result of the delegations that we brought to Israel, and we'll show you a video in a few minutes about what that feels like, what that experience means to European officials, Germany banned Hezbollah, and that led to a whole momentum of countries that joined Germany and banned Hezbollah, so that today 1/3 of Europe does not allow Iran's proxy to fundraise, to operate, to launder money, or to run drugs and ammunition and explosives across Europe, largely thanks to ELNET's work and the European governments that are fighting this Iranian arm in Europe. Look at the number 19 countries that supported Israel during the Gaza conflict last year when Hamas fired 4,500 rockets at Israel. Much of the world condemned Israel, including, unfortunately, some members of Congress and the deep progressive left here in the United States. But 19 European countries stood up for Israel publicly. Many of them sent their foreign ministers to Israel during the rocket fire to express solidarity with Israel, raise flags on government buildings in countries like Austria. When the Iranians said, we're not going to come visit you if you keep that flag flying, the flag of Israel on your government buildings, the Austrians told the Iranians, then don't come. 6 countries opposed the ICC investigation and support Israel. 22 countries boycotted the anti-Semitic Durban conference last fall in New York. Of those 22 countries, France was one of them. And those 36 legislators that visited Israel that I mentioned before lobbied their government to boycott Durban, and were successful. We were successful in helping bring more countries to the table to block a major conference on anti-Semitism and BDS that took place last year. The 10 countries that fought for Israel's inclusion in the Horizon program, which I mentioned before, this is the most important R&D program for Israel's future, at least in the next decade. And now we're seeing at least 6 countries reject the amnesty report, the malicious labeling of Israel as an apartheid state. And we're working on more countries joining that process as well. So the policy impact is very clear to us when we bring legislators to Israel, when we engage them and educate them and show them the country so that they can experience it firsthand, when they meet with the prime minister, when they meet with the army, when they go to the north or the south to see what Hamas, what the danger is to the Israelis, or in the north, what Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, what that means. And when they see it with their own eyes, they go home as ambassadors of Israel and ambassadors of the Jewish people. So we believe that this work is very, very important. It is expensive because we handle all of this privately. We bring these delegations. There's some government support, both from Israel and from Europe, for various programs. And you'd be surprised. The German government, for example, is putting large amounts of money on the table to help ELNET bring Israeli high tech to Germany, because Germany does need innovation and technological digitization and so on, and AI and healthcare and cybersecurity and so on. So they're actually funding some of our operations. But the ability to do this, to bring 25 delegations to Israel, when you think about the fact that every legislator or every official coming to Israel is roughly $5,000 for a small organization like ours to do in 36 different countries through the 5 offices that we have, and the 1 office in Israel, is an extraordinary effort. But what we're going to show you now is a very quick, brief clip of what it feels like, what it looks like, what it sounds like to go on an ELNET delegation to northern Israel and to visit the Hezbollah tunnel that the IDF leaves open for us to host delegations and show them how significant the infrastructure of terror is and what the threat of Iran really means to all of us, and certainly to future stability in the Middle East. So if we can show the short video, we will move on to the exchange with Rabbi Gizel.
Today we took some 15 European ambassadors and representatives to the northern border of Israel with 5 civilian helicopters. They saw how narrow Israel is when on one side they can see the Mediterranean, on the other side they can see already the Palestinian territories.
There were 6 tunnels that crossed the blue line and were cut off by Israel. There are other tunnels that Hezbollah started digging elsewhere.
I was deeply shocked when I was told that it cost $5 million per tunnel.
You hear very clearly from the IDF the threat that it posed. So if fighters had come through those tunnels, they could have done horrendous harm to innocent people.
Well, this was an interesting trip today because it shows the complexity of the northern border and the security situation.
I had the opportunity to learn things that I didn't know before from the briefings that I had from IDF officers.
Very important part of our job is to report from the field, so now we can have a full picture of the happenings on the ground. So we are very grateful to ELNET for this trip. It has been organized in a very professional, excellent manner.
Okay.
David, thank you so much. Where to start? So I actually thinking we could work backwards in the
Sure.
sense that so fascinating the slide that you put up saying the number of countries, versus the particular act. And when you said, or the slide said 6 countries that have rejected the statement from Amnesty, working on more. I was a little disheartened to hear 6, in comparison to the number of countries that have gone on these missions with you. What does it look like to, along with going on missions, what does it look like to get a country to reject that kind of statement? And are you able to say, I don't know if you're able to do so or not, are you able to name particular countries that you're working on?
Well,
if not,
thank
it's
you,
okay.
Rabbi.
I would just
No, absolutely. Look, there
or
while there are-
reframing, which relationships are you
Sure.
strengthening in order to?
Right. So there are 36 countries in Europe, and every vote counts. I mean, 27 are part of the EU, and there are others out. Some are NATO members, and we'll be seeing all sorts of names of countries in the coming days in the context of Ukraine. But for our purposes, for Israel's purposes, there are really 4 centers of power in Europe, whether they're in the EU or not. So it's the UK post-Brexit. There's France, of course, which is the diplomatic heart of Europe. There's Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe. And after the United States is really considered Israel's second most important strategic ally in the world. And if you think about the nuclear submarines, you think about the battleships, this is German-made, German finance or partially financed to help Israel carry the burden of these costs. There's the future of submarines that are in the pipeline that are incredibly important. So those 3 countries, individual countries, are critical. And I just want to say, just for the record, so that everybody understands, there's a lot of cynicism about Europe and so on. The UK is tougher than the United States in the JCPOA talks on nuclear Iran. The French are the second most tough, and in 2015 were the last holdovers. They were fighting the rest of the partners to the P5+1 in the negotiations with Iran, and they were against many provisions in the deal that we're going to have to face now, because the sunset provisions, for example, which we cynically say it's not going to be longer and stronger, it's going to be shorter and weaker, because the sunset provisions are so soon. They're coming, by 2025 already, in 2-3 years. So the French and the British and the German are the major powers, and of course that also translates into the EU in Brussels, where it's really the individual countries that call the shots, but the EU bureaucracy, of course, has a say as well, and we have an office there to engage the EU itself. So I would say that we start there. Those are the main countries, and then we can look at different, secondary actors that are also very important. Israel has many friendly countries in Europe. I mean, think about the Czech Republic. What you hear from the Czech, if you want to really hear a Zionist, you should go to Prague. It's really incredible. This is a small country. They felt totalitarianism, obviously, under the Soviet yoke. They emerged as a proud democracy. They historically have been very close to the Jewish state, and hear them right now. I mean, what they're saying about Ukraine, what they're saying about Iran, missile threats, Israel. So we're planning to bring more and more delegations from those countries as well, but we start with the biggest and most powerful one.
Thank you. And along those lines with Iran, I mean, what you started with in saying that to look now, we have to shift our focus as the U.S. being the strongest security force focusing on Israel, that today, in the last 24 hours or so, that's all shifted. I'm curious if you could speak more about Israel's security today and speak about it in the light of an Iranian threat.
Right. So, traditionally we always said, and it's very true today, that there are really 3 or 4 pillars to Israel's strength and power. And the first, of course, was the military strength, the conventional, unconventional. There are those that say Israel never admits it, that Israel is a nuclear power, but certainly conventional, unconventional. Its technological power, which is really the backbone of Israel's economy and ability to do all these great things. And it's also, much of the world wants part of Israel's technology. And, we need to understand it really is most of the world. I mean, Japan and Korea and China and India and the Arab countries. I mean, much of the Abraham Accords is about, this need to tap into innovation, Israeli innovation, whether it's food security, water, cyber technologies, healthcare, high tech, even semiconductors. All of that is Israel's, really at the cutting edge. So the military power, the economic power, the technological power, but the fourth pillar was, and is the alliance with the United States that really provides Israel not just with shared values, but a whole host of sources of strength. Now, when the global order shifts, and it has been shifting for a while now, and the U.S. for many years now has been, and it's not just this administration, and it wasn't just Trump, it was, obviously during the Obama years as well, but even in Bush, in the second term of Bush Jr., we began seeing this shifting of the United States, the pivot towards Asia, and for justifiable reasons. I mean, China is going to be a major challenge for the United States for at least a decade and a half. The issue of Taiwan is front and center, and the future of technology and control of the Far East, the Pacific, and so on. So, we understand that, and the United States also understands that Israel needs to build its own alliances to help the United States in that part of the world, because the United States is going to be involved in other parts of the world much more than ever before. So, so Israel needs these alliances, both for economic reasons, for security reasons, strategic reasons, and for diplomatic support. I think we tend to forget, when Israel goes into Gaza, unfortunately, and needs to stop rocket fire, it really matters if it's 15 days or 17 days, if Israel had the time to complete what it needed to complete before the world forced it to stop. And sometimes it comes down to a vote, to a country. And if you have European countries standing up with Israel in this day and age, it's very, very important. So to your question about the security threat. So let's just start with the fallout from Ukraine. So first of all, grain prices, gas and oil prices, the whole Middle East imports, is a net importer of both food and energy from both sides, Ukraine and Russia. You look at Lebanon, which is already in free fall. I think it's close to 100% of their wheat comes from Ukraine. So, think about the fallout on stability in the Middle East just in terms of pure economics. But Iran has been rising for decades now, as we know, both on the nuclear level, but also in terms of its proxy power, the precision missiles that have proliferated everywhere, and Israel's trying to stop it. I mean, just this week, according to the press, if you look carefully, you'll see that Israel attacked in Syria 3 times. 3 times. Each one of those attacks, alleged attacks, we don't, Israel doesn't officially confirm them, is to stop Iranian supplies, usually of precision-guided missiles, whether placed in Syria or in Lebanon. And this is growing all the time. It's expanding to Iraq. It's expanding to Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen are firing rockets and UAVs, armed UAVs at the UAE, at Saudi Arabia, with absolutely no response by the world. So, what we're seeing in Ukraine is maybe the big one, but there have been precedents to this that have been very, very problematic. So Israel's security situation, with a rising Iran, with a distracted global community, with the JCPOA, which is going to be much worse than the 2015 agreement, is going to put Israel in a very, very difficult place. And again, for this, we need allies. We need people to understand and leaders to understand what Israel is doing and why it's doing it, in order to build that diplomatic and political support that we need.
So along that issue of building allyship, building allies. I was curious while you were speaking, if there's any fear that those who participate in the Abraham Accords might not feel as strong of an allegiance as they once did. Is there any worry about that as this threat of invasion, or rather as the invasion takes place?
Look, I think the future of the world is really held in balance right now between the West or the supporters of the American international order and authoritarian countries that are trying to take it down. So, you don't need me to tell you that Putin is probably looking for much more than just Ukraine, both in Europe and internationally. There is a certain convergence between Russia and China, which is very dangerous, and Iran, by the way, and the three of them engaged in a three-way military exercise and are signing long-term strategic agreements. So you really are seeing the world dividing into these two camps. And this is a very, very dangerous situation. So it really depends how what the West does, because if the price is high and if the alliance really holds together, and again, sanctions won't be enough. If there's power, put on the table to face the brute force of really these global bullies, then you have a chance. What we've seen until now, if Iran continues to rise in its influence, the Arab countries tend to gravitate towards the rising power. If the United States is perceived as leaving the region and they're exposed, they may converge or they may tend towards Iran. And you're even seeing it in India, not just in the Persian Gulf. But to date, what we have seen, thankfully, is actually that this is playing in Israel's favor, because these countries see Israel as a powerful anchor of stability and support for them, both economically and militarily. And by that, I mean the Gulf countries, North Africa, certainly Egypt, Jordan. Think about what Israel and Egypt have been doing together for years in Sinai. So these alliances are solidifying. And I would argue that, in the greater region, from India to Spain, more and more countries are coming and converging with Israel's interests as a result of what we're seeing.
Along with what we're seeing in terms of not just the impact on Israel, but also the way that Israel is supporting Ukrainian refugees at the moment. I don't know if you can speak towards that, the way that Israel is being a beacon of light within this context.
So, I think it's also very important to remember that Israel is in a very difficult place right now strategically, because on the one hand, Israel, of course, needs to be part of the Western alliance and the condemnation of this aggression. But on the other hand, we have to remember that the power sitting on Israel's fence, Israel's new next door neighbor, actually not so new, it's almost a decade now, is Russia. And Russia controls Syria, controls the skies over Syria, controls Israel's ability to defend itself, the Air Force, when it needs to operate in hundreds upon hundreds of missions, sometimes daily, over Syria and sometimes beyond. And it's in very close vicinity to the Russian forces. Russia has GPS capabilities, radar capabilities covering all of Israel. So this is a powerful bear on Israel's fences. So Israel has to be very, very aware of that and be very careful in the way it's responding to this crisis. There are 8,000 Israelis in Ukraine right now, stranded, like everyone else, in those long traffic jams. It's very difficult for them to get out. So 8,000 Israelis are now in direct threat. There are 300,000 Jews in the Ukraine, of which 40,000 are in a destitute situation. They were before, and they certainly are now. In Russia, if I'm not mistaken, there are 800,000 Jews, and many tens of thousands of Israelis or dual citizenship holders. So Israel has made it very clear, obviously, that any Israeli that needs shelter, Israel's there to help as much as it can. And of course, every Jew on both sides of the border. So we have diplomats and capabilities on the borders of Ukraine right now. Ironically, in Poland and the Polish-Israel tensions now are meeting a very clear need to work together on the border, both to accommodate Jewish refugees and Israeli new refugees, let's call it. And Israel said very publicly that it is preparing the ground to shelter Jews in need, always did, always will, and certainly will now. But again, it's very difficult logistically to make this happen right now. But it's an important value that we uphold.
So a few more questions have come in, but I want to ask you, in terms of what's happening now in the Ukraine, what's ELNET's role today?
So first of all, we came out with a statement, of course, condemning this aggression, and we stand together with the Europeans, and we really are a European or an organization that is dedicated to strengthening Europe's relations with Israel and vice versa. It's important for people to understand that we have a US side to this, the Friends of ELNET, of the European Leadership Network, and we have an office here in New York, in Chicago, in LA. Sia's with us tonight, Sia Kordestani, who is our West Coast director, who is amazing, and please be in touch with him to follow up with us if you're interested. And our 5 offices right now are working in multiple countries to work with politicians to prepare their trips to Israel, to talk about the Ukraine, to talk about Iran, the rising cost of energy, the growing pressure to release the Iranian oil. We don't want these countries to compromise in the negotiations as well as we can, although we know that a very bad deal is impending. The only thing, ironically, that may delay it is the fact that Russia is part of the negotiating coalition of the P5+1 together, the United States and Europe. So you can assume that that's probably not going to go as smoothly as everyone thought. So this thing may be delayed. Explaining the danger of Iran being weeks away from military grade enrichment and having multiple sites that were not well inspected, and talking about what the Mossad took out of Tehran in terms of the nuclear archives, and proving to the world what we already knew, that there are secret sites, that there are military aspects to this program that are very, very clear and self-declared by the Iranians. So there's no and to make sure that the Europeans understand again and again and again what is at stake. So that's what ELNET is doing as we go through this crisis.
So an interesting question came in. If you could speak towards the radical Islamist threat, in particular, this question asked about France, and whether, and to speak towards the idea that this threat is not just a threat to the West, but also a threat to moderate Muslims.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and it's a big part of our work. So France is front and center. It's very close to Israel. There are many French Jews, as you know, in Israel, and more that will come. We foresee additional tens of thousands that are expected to come to Israel in future years, added to already a community of over 100,000 or 150,000 that came over the last decade, largely as a result of the Islamic threat. There's been Islamic terrorism in Europe, throughout Europe, over at least the last 15 years. France has really been one of the epicenters of this. So the French public, very different from the trends in the United States, by the way, is much more concerned about this Islamic issue and Islamic extremism in their country. The elections now that Macron it will be in very, very close elections next month. His main opponents are on the right and the far right, not on the left and the far left. They've been marginalized in France. The country is very concerned about Islamic extremism. And the sense among the political establishment is that the more the Islamic extremists radicalize, the more that fuels right-wing populism. And if you're a mainstream politician, you see a threat on both sides, and so do we. So what is interesting is that the Muslim community in many countries in Europe, but certainly in France, is divided because you have the extremists and you have pockets of extremism, but you also have a rising generation of moderate Muslim leaders that are incredible. They're simply incredible. First of all, they mirror what we're seeing in the UAE and Bahrain, because what they yearn for is peace and coexistence with the Jewish community and with Israel. They are threatened by radical Islam themselves. They see it as a threat to their own future. They come to Israel, they work with ELNET, they lead delegations, they bring their young leaders, some of them who used to be BDS supporters and now are serious supporters of Israel because they've seen the country. We take them to Akko, to Haifa, to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, to see mixed cities, to see how by and large communities live together better than they do in Europe and coexist. And actually they come to Israel to see a model of how these communities interact that they need to learn how to do because they're not well integrated in Europe, and this is part of the problem. So radical Islamism in Europe is one of the reasons why Europe is converging more and more with Israel in recent years, and why you're seeing these kind of expressions of support for Israel. We've had 3 conferences this year on Islamic extremism in Europe. We've had former prime ministers of France, of Great Britain, senior politicians from other countries, because everyone understands that this is a major challenge and it connects to anti-Semitism, because leaders in Europe are not fighting anti-Semitism as a favor to the Jewish community. They're fighting anti-Semitism because they see it as a threat to their own societies, and well, they should. And what this means is that we have real allies, solid allies that are fighting for the same cause out of their own self-interest that happens to also be our self-interest, which is probably the healthiest relationship you can have.
David, when you say 3 conferences, are these separate conferences or these are through ELNET? Did ELNET host these conferences?
These are all ELNET conferences.
Wow.
We did 2 online. The 3rd was hybrid, and the 4th is coming up in March, and it will be fully in person. And we expect to see 500 people there. It's in the midst of the French elections. In France, you should know that after COVID and maybe Ukraine now, Islamism, radical Islamism, is the most important issue in these elections. So it's important to understand that these are different political environments. Not everything is like the United States, where you have your usual Republicans on the right, center, and then, a hard left that is very skeptical about things, certainly Middle East things. In Europe, it's a completely different picture, and certainly in countries like France.
I promise I didn't plant this question, but one of our viewers said, other than support and contributions, and they would like to know the website for ELNET. How else can people get involved, learn more about ELNET, and offer their personal support?
Wonderful, thank you for that question. So we've become a network that is very engaged with our donors and supporters, and even people that are just interested. We have a weekly discussion with an expert, and usually very senior experts from Israel and from Europe, and sometimes from the United States, every Monday at 9 a.m. LA time. You can sign up and register with us and receive our emails. We send out policy updates, serious updates about what we see as important for you to know. We work with our donors, and especially senior donors, and they receive video recordings of in-depth briefings. That Israel's ambassador to the United States, Mike Herzog, was our strategic advisor, our senior strategic director until a few months ago. He was nominated to be Israel's ambassador to Washington, left ELNET, and then we were joined by General Amos Yadlin, who is a very prolific writer these days, especially right now. And he delivers a weekly briefing for our senior donors that we record on video and send to you, so that you get the most updated analysis of what's happening on all of these issues. So you can join us on our website and register, and we'll be happy to send you our information. And Sia is with us tonight, and we will share the website with you. It's www.elnetworks.org, if I'm not mistaken. And you can follow us on Twitter and on our website. We invite it. I need to tell you, my diplomatic career, I was with the Israeli government for almost 30 years. And there you go. You have the ELNET website.
I don't know if they can see that or not, or if it just are.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's
yeah.
www.elnetwork.eu, EU for Europe.
Okay, and I just saw that Rebecca Small is going to put that in the chat so that everyone else
Wonderful.
can see it.
Thank you. So, and so I focused on the United States and Israel for many, many years. And of course, I still believe that the United States is, of course, Israel's most important ally. But even allies need help. And I deeply, deeply believe in this cause. I've been with ELNET now over 5 years, pretty much since I left your community in LA and took early retirement from the Israeli government. And I've realized over these 5-6 years how important this mission is. When you're working in an environment where there's really no other pro-Israel folks, and think about all the organizations here in the United States that are working on Israel-US issues, from campuses to Congress to everything. And in Europe, you really don't have that. And you think about the Europeans being the largest economic bloc, the largest liberal democratic, group of countries in the world, right on Israel's doorstep. There's nothing more important than this. And in this day and age, where America is overburdened both domestically and internationally, and this is just the beginning, my friends, Ukraine is just the beginning of a new international reality. We're going to have to do more for ourselves, for our Jewish communities, for Israel. And one of the major ways of doing that is by connecting with us, by connecting to the largest pro-Israel network that is covering the largest group of democratic countries adjacent to Israel, right outside of the Middle East and directly affected by everything happening in the Middle East. So I really believe that this is the way to do it. And if you want to learn more about this, please take a look at our materials.
David, if I can just emphasize your point. Today, the Jewish Journal came out with an article, What Israel Must Learn from Ukraine's War. And the essence of the article is that exactly what you said, Israel needs allies more than ever, that Israel's security cannot be taken for granted, certainly in the climate as you described. And the way to do that, I don't know if ELNET is necessarily mentioned, but they certainly speak about the threats to Israel right now. And you've given us a very strong answer as to how do we move forward from here. And so a plea to all those who are watching and those who will watch later, we cannot take Israel's friendships and security for granted. We must strengthen our relationships with those in Europe, and the way to do so is through this incredible organization of ELNET, led by really our beloved David Siegel. So David, we would really follow you anywhere, but we are thrilled that you're at the helm of truly this remarkable organization that will continue to secure our state of Israel. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and thank you on behalf of the Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center. I truly hope everyone who is listening gets involved and learns more about ELNET, and I am sure that this will be a conversation to be continued.
Rabbi, you're the best. It's such an honor to be with you, and thank you everyone for your commitment to both your community and the state of Israel. And I hope to see you in person, hopefully in June. We'll be bringing our director from the UK, who's an amazing woman. She's an Irish Catholic Zionist who has been fighting for Israel, who fought Corbyn, who walked away from his party, took 7 members of parliament with her, and really began the downfall of that anti-Semite in the UK. Her name is Joan Ryan. She'll be coming to LA with us in June, and we'll be able to convene in person, via Kel, in person.
Beautiful. Okay, I look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, David.